Alrighty, hello everyone. Welcome. Today, Noah and I are going to be discussing his recent trip to the Du Bois Symposium, hosted by the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. We'll also be talking about Noah's concept of reproletarianization, somewhat of a mouthful, but a very good concept. And then we'll also be interacting a little bit with the chat and answering whatever questions you all have. So uh, let's get started with our introduction.
Yeah.
Also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the live stream. Tonight, like Carlos was just saying, we're going to be talking about my concept of reproletarianization and going over my trip to Philly last weekend. I really want to talk about that first because it was in all ways such a positive experience. I drove there. And by the way, thank you to everybody who donated to help me get there. We covered the entire trip, so thank you again. But yeah, so it was like a 7-hour drive in, and I ate food from Dairy Queen on the way, which probably a mistake. But what are you gonna do, right? But yeah, so I got there. I was able to sort of work with Carlos on my presentation the night before, because anytime we do one of these talks, I want to make it clear this isn't just me talking. This is the Institute talking. And without Carlos, that presentation would not have been as good as it was. I wrote a bunch of different versions, actually. But anyway, so in the morning, of course, I have a problem with the map app on my phone on my way there, because why wouldn't I? Right? I need to be somewhere at a certain time. It's this big important event, and my map app completely fails. So I get there, and immediately, all the free school people, Dr. Montero and Emily, who's been sort of our contact with them, and Serafina, and just all of them turn, and they're like, "No one!" Big smiles, and they're the most friendly, welcoming, accepting people I've ever met. It was just huge. Took me in, got me coffee, made sure I felt comfortable. Yeah, it was amazing. The atmosphere there, you could tell it's such a contrast to, and I've been around the left for a while. Most places you'll go on the left. Most places are just, everyone's like got some attitude, and they're looking for what you're doing wrong. And it just the complete opposite of that.
Right, I've felt that in gatherings of that sort on the left. It's especially around like college students. It's almost like everyone's in their head trying to think, well, how much have these people read? Like, who have I read beforehand, or something like that. It's always like a compare. And the atmosphere from what you could see from the video was very much like family like, and you could tell it was a spirit of comradeship that was in the air that seemed very nice. And you confirmed that in the conversations that we had about it. But just the level of like intellectual rigor, it was so interesting because you have in academia, panels are something that's quite frequent. Most scholars, when they're working towards publishing a paper in an academic journal, they usually are recommended to present it at a panel of sorts, and then there's discussion. But you go to those panels, and it's like, there's always people in the audience trying to show off, asking tricky questions, or it's just mayhem, and it's not laid back, and it's very stiff. I had a friend that, he described it one time. He was actually under the influence of stuff, of certain
Stuff's a
substances.
good word. Yeah, stuff.
Yes, certain substances. But it was his first one, and he had this experiment. He had this experience that he doesn't know if it was him tripping out or like, an inner essential truth about that sort of event. But he felt that there was just like zoo animals around him in suits. So he was like tripping out. But there's something like, the scholarship is somewhat there, but it's always disconnected. The question always comes up, which is like, why the hell is this going on besides just a bunch of intellectual circle jerk? So that these people can present these papers, put that presentation on their CV, and then have a better shot at publishing that paper in a journal. That spirit of interaction, that sort of relationality, it didn't seem to be the case there. It seemed like scholarship and what can be done with that scholarship in terms of changing the world in a revolutionary manner were both intertwined constantly. And I think that's something very special that we try to replicate with our project. It consistently, we have folks within academia and outside of academia, but really the common thread is that we're thinking about the world in as rigorous a fashion as you can get in academia, but without that disconnection that you have in academia. We're actually active on the ground in various socialist, Marxist, communist organizations trying to change the world. And that spirit, which I think that we have always striven to uphold in our institute, I felt that in that symposium. And you also feel it. I've seen a lot of their Saturday schools that are streamed live, and they're wonderful. You also see that there, and I think that's quite unique for people on the left.
Absolutely. In a lot of ways, talking with them, hanging out with them, giving our views and learning their views, it felt a lot like hanging out with us, and that's really important, I think, because all of us there, and don't get me wrong, we all come from different places with different views. Most of the people there, they wouldn't consider them Marxists. Actually, I had a joke in my presentation that I wouldn't be a Marxist if I didn't irritatingly point out that all of these leaps in American history come after leaps in production, and everybody laughed because people know Marxists can be irritating like that, right? But we all disagree on all kinds of stuff, but that doesn't matter because we're all interested in the same thing. And the point of everyone's research, everyone's talks, everyone's thinking is liberation, right? Is building a better tomorrow. And it doesn't matter what we call it. What matters is the substance of that thing. And it comes out just in the way they all carry themselves, right? Like the minute I got there, the minute I walked in the door, Tony Montero saw me and he just runs over. He's like, Noah, and gives me a big hug. And like, that's just how the entire thing went. It was amazing. And I don't want to spend the whole time talking about, they're nice, because they're also goddamn brilliant, right? These people are very rigorous in their thought, and it came out in their presentations. The guy, and I wrote down names because I'm terrible with names and I have a bad memory, but the guy who was right before me and gave his presentation right before me, I'm very glad, by the way, I didn't do my takedown of Gerald Horn version of the presentation, because he did that. and he explains exactly why Horn is incorrect on all these things when it comes to W.E.B. Du Bois. And it was brilliant. I was blown away sitting there getting to listen to this. And it wasn't just that. I got to sit on a panel with them. And it was just all around like a fantastic, it could not have gone better. Also, after the event, the free school folks took me to get Indian food. And I'm not a big fan of Indian food, but guess what they had there? They had wingdings. So I was happy. It was great.
The name of the comrade was Jahan, by the way, the one that presented on Horn. I heard most of it. It's a shame that the audio quality wasn't as good because, you know, the content was just terrific. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if they would consider themselves Marxists or not, but according to at least what Marxism is for me, with how the Marxist worldview approaches the world, I think they check all the major boxes, all the key boxes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, 100%.
I think that's in part because they're grounded on this triad of Du Bois, Baldwin, and King, which Winston, right? So I guess not triad, but quad. You know, they're grounded on these thinkers that have been at the forefront of the struggle to move society forward. And really, you know, what is Marxism deep down, if not the agents which consciously strive to be the ones which abolish the present state of things? You know, that's how Marx and Engels described communism very early on in the German ideology. You know, communism is not a definite state towards which we're striving for, but it's the real movement of history which abolishes the present state of things. And insofar as they're thinking through the world with the lens of Du Bois, which to me is, you know, Marxism, Leninism concretized to the particularities of the American condition, to, you know, a society divided by a color line. You know, so it's Marxism, Leninism. It is Marxism, Leninism, but in the context of the U.S. So for me, you know, I don't know if they consider themselves Marxists or not, but they're definitely, I think, ideologically on the same plane, in the same worldview as the one that I think we're operating from. And you know, we have to remember there's a lot of people that call themselves Marxist this, Marxist that, Marxist all these things, and then, you know, they come to analyze reality, or they speak about, you know, the relations between certain key concepts, and you're like, you know, this couldn't be any farther, right? Because you have the words, but you don't have the essence. You don't have, you know, the relation that terms have to each other, and, you know, the approach to the world, and you don't have the method, you don't have the essence of the worldview. And so it's, yeah, it definitely feels like there's a commonality there, even if it's not like labeled as a commonality.
Well, 1,000%. And I think we should be really cognizant of an over-reliance on labels, which is so prevalent in our era of the brand marketing economy. But for me, if your thought is grounded on, and the foundation of it is W.E.B. Du Bois, then that's Marxism. You know, that was, I refer to him in the presentation actually as the father of American Marxism. And I don't say that for no reason, right? He was applying the dialectical materialist world outlook to our condition and innovating something new in his thought on race and the revolution of the Civil War. And I mean, they all are very, very advanced in that thought, and they go through these, you know, word by word, making sure they understand it. And it's really, really incredibly inspiring. They weren't all just nice. They were all very inspiring. My favorite presentation of the whole night came from someone that you and I met when we initially talked to them, Serafina, if you remember her. She did one where she sort of drew from one of Baldwin's stories. And it was, I forget the name of it, something like Up the Road. But it was like, I was about to cry. It was so beautiful. The way she put it all together was just amazing. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but by the way, they have one of the best, most theoretically correct slogans I've ever heard. And I think it comes out of Baldwin. It is, "We march to achieve our nation." And that is just so perfect, because what is the process of the last couple hundred years but America becoming itself, and this continual forward progress of a people that have been divided by, race, by nationality, by religion, by everything they could divide us by, just continually fighting against that and overcoming the limitations that division sets upon us, right? And for me, that's the entire story of America, is overcoming division. And when they say we march to achieve our nation, that's precisely what it is. It's us actualizing in the dialectical sense.
Right. And it's not like unity. Perfect unity is like what is presupposed for struggle. It's in the process of struggle that division is overcome, which is not like today, where the way that the left approaches the working class in the U.S. Is that only certain sections of it are organizable. Other sections don't have the perfect form of enlightened social consciousness, or what they consider to be enlightened social consciousness, and therefore they can't be approached. And if you really think that those parts of the working class are backwards, then the only solution for overcoming that backwardness is to engage with them in a collective class struggle. In the process of struggling, consciousness is elevated. But if you just point at them and say no, and you treat them in a very paternalistic form, you're only going to alienate them towards other forces which arise in moments of crisis, more perhaps fascistic forces. So yeah, and I think that that
Real
the top
quick,
boys.
Real quick, let me interrupt you. That's exactly what Mao taught, right? And he said, as to the backwards workers, communists should befriend them and bring them in and pull their beliefs, which may seem on the surface backwards, into a more progressive direction. Nobody, is at their heart hateful, just inherently hateful. And speaking of Du Bois, his I just realized I interrupted you, so go ahead. I'm sorry. I apologize, Carlos.
Well, yeah. There's always something that there's always in whatever form the incoherence of a part of the working class's worldview takes. There's always going to be something that can be used to rearticulate them towards socialism. And I think that the part of the working class that today the left rejects the most, probably that part of the working class which engages with Trump, which sees Trump as an anti-establishment candidate. As now, we're hoping to do a stream tomorrow reacting to his postulation for candidacy in 2024 as a peace candidate. That part of the left which sees that section of the working class that goes with Trump as fascists or racist bigots. And it's not to say that in the bunch there aren't people that are that hold prejudiced views against minorities and stuff, but it's you have to look at, I think, the substance of why it is that a good portion of these people are attracted by Trump. And I think that if you look at the substance, there's a plethora of rational kernels that you can take and rearticulate to socialism. A lot of these people are discontent about the existing state of affairs. They're discontent about both parties. That's why the narrative about draining the swamp and about the establishment and the deep state, that's why it rings with them, and they're able to identify with it, because it's genuinely it's putting words, which I think are to some extent not perfect, in some ways incorrect, but it's putting words to a discontent that the American people have been feeling for decades now, and that neither party has been able to address. And there's more than enough to take from there and move them to socialism. And when Eddie and I were in undergrad our last year and we were organizing for Bernie Sanders, we often say this, but out of like 10 people that were in our central committee at the, school's socialist club, maybe 7 or 8 of them were Trump voters in the previous election. And we were able to get them because they were skeptical of the media, fake news. Well, that's been the left's thing for decades. For Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality, like Trump's fake news. It's very easy to shape them from there to a correct position. The question of war was important to them. The question of industry and the lack of productive capacities in the U.S. and why there aren't jobs. And Trump says he's going to bring back all of those questions. Address very real concerns that working people have because of the system. And we know that the real solution isn't Trump, and that's very easy to get them to understand that. And the experience that I have found is that when you talk to working people within that form of consciousness, it's almost as if you're putting words to something that they already understood. It's like if the words that Trump brought kind of put words to that feeling, but then when you bring in Marxism, a real genuine critique of the existing order, that's when they feel like almost instinctually like, oh, I get this.
Precisely.
So that unity is important, but it's also important to realize that unity is going to be forged in the process of struggle. If you make unity a precondition for struggle, you're not going to be able to struggle or to unify.
Right. It's like I always say, for working people, when you begin to learn Marxism, it's like finally having the words to explain what you've kind of felt all along, right? And the rest of what you were saying, it's sort of evidence against the purity fetish, right? If you make some arbitrary line that you need to put between you and working class people, you're always moving that line further and further along. And this person said X 10 years ago, turns into that person said Y 8 years ago, and it goes on and on and on. And at the end of the day, you're just sitting there by yourself with this ideal notion of purity that never existed in reality.
Right. And part of what I wanted to say before about Du Bois, just to emphasize the general importance of this symposium, which honestly, there should be one of these a year, just because of how important Du Bois is. But I just finished reading Black Reconstruction a couple of days ago. And, coming to the end of it, I'm almost embarrassed that it took me this long to read. And, that embarrassment very quickly shifted towards, a sense of the realization that I don't think it was my fault. I'm a product of my material conditions. And, none of the teachers that I had around me when I was, developing into Marxism, Leninism, no one talks about Du Bois. No one on the left talks about Du Bois. And it's such a shame. And it felt like when I finished reading Black Reconstruction, I've read a few of the other books as well, but I think I resonate the most with Black Reconstruction right now. I've read quite a few essays, collections of essays, but it felt like this here was something that was so essential and which was hidden from me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very sad because it's completely changed how I am approaching the understanding of American society, of American history. Not changing it in a radical sense. I had already agreed with some of the central positions that he is proposing, but it's concretizing something which I was on my own sort of developing, but it was still somewhat abstract. So it's such a wonderful text. And he gets to write for another 30 years after Black Reconstruction. So there's just such a wealth of knowledge there that's just completely abandoned by the left. And I know that wasn't always the case in the Communist Party. Henry Winston, which we're working on a book of Winston's selected works. Henry Winston was very much grounded in the work of Du Bois, and so was really the party at the time.
Yeah, Herbert Aptheker especially.
Herbert Aptheker,
one of the main theorists And
He was the
also,
one in charge of the collection. The collection was left
right?
to Aptheker, and yeah, now it's in Credo. You can access like all of his papers and letters through the University of Amherst, Massachusetts, the Credo thing. So it's all public, and it's really cool to be able to see like the three drafts that he does before he finishes a specific presentation or an article or something like that. So I got when I found out about that website, I literally spent like 10 hours straight just reading a bunch of things. And that's been like basically every Sunday for the last like 2 months or something.
Finding Du Bois is a lot like finding Lenin.
Right.
It's just reading it, you're just like, oh my God, everything makes sense now. And Black Reconstruction in America especially rediscovers all of American history for us. And what it does is makes sense of our class struggle and the revolutions we've had and why there hasn't been a socialist revolution yet. And all of that can be explained using that as a theoretical framework. That as the foundation that our American Marxism rests upon. And it's also a big part of what creates my theory of reproletarianization. There was something else I wanted to say about that, and now I'm forgetting.
I wanted to address a question here. Why do you think, what do you think is something the modern anti-racist activists in the U.S. should take from Du Bois? I think this is so important because one of the most clear distinctions from Du Bois's anti-racism or Pan-Africanism and what we find in contemporary philosophy of race or Africana departments, or what we find in anti-racist activism, which really just is an expression, is a reflection of how these ideologies that are crafted in the academy and then come down through the media, through NGOs, and then get to activist hubs and turn into a form of political practice. The main distinction I would say is this, and this is something that Noah presented on, which is that what's Du Bois doing when he's thinking about difference within the working class? He's not thinking about difference for the sake of ontologizing one section of the working class, specifically the white part of the working class, and condemning them as evil, and treating their activities in an ahistorical fashion, in a very essentialized way.
He does exactly the opposite.
It's a complete opposite. And one of the things that he thinks about racism, and he analyzes it from a sociological, philosophical, psychological, from various comprehensive angles, not for the sake of putting forth a full-fledged condemnation of poor whites, of ontologizing the things that he finds. But he does it for the sake of understanding the root of the splinters that you find in the working class, and seeing from the knowledge of where it comes from how to overcome it. And one of the things that at least I constantly felt, as I just mentioned, I just finished reading Black Reconstruction, is a sense of lament, and a sense of tragedy. And he references in that last chapter on the propaganda of history that something along the lines of like Reconstruction was a tragedy, to the scale of never before seen, not even by the Greek tragedies. Like it was a genuine tragedy because what's involved in the tragedy? It's potential that is left unrealized. And what you have in that period of Reconstruction is an immense potential for the northern and southern white working class unifying with the Black working class and with the immigrants that are going westward, that are making up a sort of petty bourgeois class. And he says very early on, like, if these popular classes are able to come together, they would be an irresistible force. And there's constantly so much potential if these classes are able to come together and fight against the Southern oligarchy, and against the new northern form of monopoly as never before seen. There's so much potential left unrealized. And I think that, so what's the difference between that form of thinking and today's anti-racist activism, which, ends up in a position where they proliferate the very differences which Du Bois's thinking about racism hoped to overcome. And this is so important because by emphasizing division, they are not only not helping to overcome that which keeps the working class divided and the ruling class subsequently in power, but they are actively agents in enforcing the existing order by keeping working people divided, by making the white part of the working class feel like it has to lash itself constantly in the back for the sins of its past. And that's nowhere to be found in Du Bois. Du Bois wants working class unity, not just in the nation. Like, he's a very internationalist thinker, as all communists should be. So he's thinking about unity. How do we unify these popular classes? And that's, I think, the ultimate goal. And that's what's completely lost in Du Bois scholarship today and in other forms of anti-racist activism and race theorizing. And it's not a minor difference. It's a very, very, very essential difference that places one in a progressive position, i.e. Du Bois, and the other in a reactionary or at least conservative position.
Precisely. It places them in a reactionary position because it goes to the same foundational ideological and incorrect notions that created the racism in the first place. That we are inherently separate, that races are inherently one thing or another. What Du Bois does instead is explains through what he calls the wages of whiteness, or the psychological wage, why this racism occurred. And in explaining how it occurs and what happens with it, he explains why it's not inherent, right? And like Carlos said, all of this is in the effort of overcoming it. I actually went deep, as deep as I could in a 10-minute presentation this weekend. I can read the section if you want me to, Carlos. I pulled it up real quick while you were saying that. Let me see here. In their purity fetishization, they essentialize and ontologize what Du Bois instead explains the creation and inner mechanics of racism in particular. His concept of the psychological wage of poor whites was not calling it an inherent and essential aspect of their skin colors or ethnicities, as many of these academics treat it, reducing their thought to what Henry Winston would call a skin strategy. Precisely the opposite. Du Bois's theorizing of these schisms in American society was done in order to understand what gave rise to them, how they function, and how they can be overcome. Far from a binary good and evil moral condemnation of poor whites, and there being some essential content inherent within a race, Du Bois had extreme sympathy for this forgotten class of people while still recognizing the capacity for harm and reaction. And he put his hopes in its ability to form an alliance with the Black working class in the North and the South, and also the immigrant petty bourgeoisie of the West, which is exactly what Carlos was just talking about, by the way. And Carlos and I worked for a long time on that particular section and how to get it concise like that.
And now, he literally says that, like, it's a forgotten class of people. And what's funny, Eddie just recently read, I don't think this summer, but the last summer, he was reading Capital alongside Edward Baptista's book, The Half Has Never Been Told. And it's a laudable book. Eddie very much enjoyed it. He saw overlaps with Marx's discussion of industry and the role that slavery in the South, the Southern Kingdom, played for not just Northern American capitalism, but really capitalism at large, specifically English industrial capitalism. And Eddie very much liked the book, but the title is is that really the half that has never been told? Because one of the things that Du Bois notices is that it's not only the case that the Black worker in the South, the Black slave, is left out and treated by the historians of the time as if it was just the first peoples in the world to be liberated without having to lift a finger. which I think is a situation that has kind of changed after Du Bois, and rightfully
Well,
so.
let me cut
But
in real quick.
let me finish this point real
Sure,
quick.
sure. Go ahead.
But
Sorry.
the side that has like actually never been told, has been the side of the poor whites, which no one talks about, and which lived in a very tragic existence of manifesting the most hideous forms of racism, the most barbaric forms of activity, while being in the most degrading positions in society, or one of the most degrading positions in society, especially after emancipation. So it's that book, Eddie talks about it, and it's I haven't read it. It seems like a very good book, but the title, I don't know if it's necessarily correct. I feel like Du Bois would say now that really the story that still hasn't been told has been the one of these poor whites, which he literally called a forgotten class of men.
Well, he's the one telling the story of the black proletariat, right? And becoming itself. And he does it absolutely poetically. I think remembering our Marxist grounding in this is super important on why these things were told, these stories are told the way they were, why historians of the past basically took away the agency of the black proletariat, because in that era, with them as slaves, people weren't taught to see them as human. And this comes directly from the conditions around them that created those thoughts. And so it didn't even occur to them, which is crazy to think of now, right? I want to address a couple questions from the audience here real quick. Don Hammond says, non-blacks are rightfully worried about the increase in status competition which unity would beget. This is why coalitions with labor orgs didn't work. Now, Du Bois actually gets into this in Black Reconstruction, and he talks about how the labor unions were originally against abolition because they thought it would drive their wages down. And he explains why this wasn't the case, right? And he explains why the alliance of the black worker, which because of it, precisely where it was in production at that point in time, and its revolution consisted of the vanguard of the entire working class at the time, would have increased the standard of living of the entire working class overall. But the white workers, ideologically speaking, as the bourgeois ideology is always hegemonic in bourgeois society, weren't ready for that at that point in time. Today, however, different story altogether, right? We're post-civil rights revolution now, or which was sort of a political revolution, right? We're post-civil rights movement, regardless of how you want to think about it. And that's no longer the case. For all of us now, we're all human beings. We also got a super chat we could get to.
Yeah, the right. The main cause I see of despair, which is the inability of the working class to unite because of the racism of the white part of the working class, I think that the fact that a big portion of that is gone today, which is not to say, because I know someone's going to comment about it, it's not to say that racism doesn't exist, right? But if people have this tendency to look at the civil rights movement or revolution and really undermine it because things are not perfect today, or because parts of it were left unfinished. And I get I understand that sentiment, and it's one that I had maybe a few years ago, and I think it comes from this place of like, for some people, youthful radicalism, or this desire for purity, or the purity fetish. Really, frankly, it wasn't pure. There was limitations, but really, it's a whole new America after the civil rights movement, and there's no way you can compare even the racism that exists today with the racism that existed, at this time, which was governed by lynching and just segregation. Jim Crow.
We don't have Jim Crow anymore. That's gigantic. Suffrage is gigantic.
Right. So it's a whole new world, and I think that gives me so much hope, because the main obstacle was that racism, and now I think that the conditions today are more favorable than they have ever been for a united working class movement in the country.
Yeah.
And so I ended up with when I finished the reading with a whole lot of hope for what today can be, because of this central obstacle being not fully removed but largely removed, especially in the mass of American workers.
Right. If you look at the history of America from before the Republic was founded to now, it's a story of working class people through striving for the high ideals set down in our Declaration of Independence, overcoming the divisions that ruling class has set upon us, and becoming more and more one, becoming more and more the American people. And so when they talked about that slogan that we march to achieve our nation, that's precisely what is possible nowadays. And MLK's political revolution lays the groundwork for that, right? But that couldn't have happened without the Civil War and Second Revolution, the abolition of slavery, which couldn't have happened without overthrowing the British Empire, right? All of these are a material part of our history, and they create the immense possibility of now and tie into the necessity of now. A lot of my presentation there was on necessity, and necessity being why Du Bois was just always truthful, always looking deeper and correcting what was wrong in the past. Let's get to the super chat, though. It's been a minute since it was up. Andrew Ray asks, by the way, thank you, Andrew. Thoughts on how this relates to Frank Chapman's Marxist-Leninist perspectives on Black liberation and socialism. Now, I don't remember what we were talking about. That was you were asking for the relation on, but I do know that Chapman is another American hero, and that book is fantastic. In the very beginning, he destroys that Cedric Robinson Black Marxism book, right, which basically tries to say that Marxism has no use for anyone but Western Europeans, and that there is instead this Black radical tradition which takes its place and which doesn't need the Marxist scientific world outlook. And he actually claims Du Bois as part of this, who was a Marxist, right? Which doesn't make much sense. It's a fantastic book. I loved it, by the way.
Yeah, we have tried to reach out to Frank to see if we can do an interview on it, but I don't think the means that we have reached out through have been the best. So we're going to continue trying to see if we can get an interview with Frank. I think he's either 80 or 81. So, yeah, I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. I actually just recently ordered it, so I hope to get into it pretty soon, maybe in preparation for questions that we can ask in some form of an interview or something. But Shaya Bat CV says that American cities are still extremely segregated, though. Look at Chicago. Yeah. And I think Ohio, Cleveland is one of those as well, right?
Yep. On the west side of Cleveland, it's white. East side, it's black, basically. It was one of the most heavily redlined cities in the country. If you're unfamiliar with what redlining was, when they were creating the middle classes, and they were created, right? And it was done through forcing that through militant labor struggles, the existence of the Soviet Union, etc. But when they were creating these, part of it was giving working class people a form of stability in home ownership. And so they gave incredibly cheap home loans to people, white people, right? That was really important. And all of the areas on one side of the red line, and it was the red line because it was the side they put the blacks and the communists, right? And the Jews. So, well, they're Jews that weren't rich. On one side, you had all of these, and on the other, that's where all of these home loans were. So that is still the material history we have. After segregation was ended legally, it's still concretely there, right? These homes don't disappear. that there hasn't been enough time for everybody to get closer together yet, although it is happening, right? I grew up on the east side of Cleveland, which is the black side, and it is noticeably more run down than the west side. However, the poor parts of the west side are just as bad as the east side. So it's a class thing. The issue is that the black working class, because of that history, has to face a more complete immiseration.
Right. And I don't think that the process has been completed because there's
Mhm.
such geographical demarcations and physical color lines still in so many areas. But in workplaces, they've been um, diversified greater than ever before in American history. And I think that it's that constant coming into contact with people who might have different backgrounds but have the same relation to production as you do, that are in the same class as you, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their sex, or whatever it might be. It's that process of coming into contact with them which I think can help destroy racism, which MLK describes it as a view which holds that there are certain classes of people, certain races of people which are ontologically superior, and certain races of people which are ontologically inferior. Now, racist structures might still exist, and I think they do. You see it in the prison, you see it in policing. They're also very much grounded on class based oppression of the state on poor people. But I think that sort of widespread view that you had even 60 years ago by poor white communities about the ontological superiority of the white race and the ontological inferiority of the black race, I don't think that is as anywhere near as prominent as it was then. And that means that the conditions for struggling today as one united working class are more favorable than ever. And it's not to say that there aren't shortcomings for the civil rights movement. We fight today to realize, right? Remember, the second phase of the civil rights movement was more explicitly engaging in a form of class struggle, engaging in the politics of peace. And I think that if there's something today that must be done is bring back that politics of peace in a way that's interrelated to the labor movement, to the question of the poor, to the question of whose interests the state actually prioritizes. And it's becoming clearer and clearer and clearer that the ruling class and its political pundits do not give a shit about the American people, and all they care about is controlling the international situation to defend finance capital abroad and the interest of great American transnational corporations. So it couldn't be any clearer to the mass of people, and events like the train derailment in Ohio, Palestine, and other such events show those contrasts very openly. Eddie just did a great segment on, where was Biden
Right.
and sold tobacco? He was with Zelensky, promising to
Exactly.
give more aid to Ukraine instead of helping his people at home in Ohio, Palestine. And the American people are not stupid. They see this. There's no massive network that can clarify, these relations in a theoretical and concrete manner as Marxists are able to. But with time and with hard work on the ground, I think that
We're building it now.
we're building it now. Exactly.
Right.
So
And
for
so
surely.
what I'd like to add to that is that reproletarianization is precisely what lies the base foundation for this unity of the working class and the end of racism, right? Well, end is a very big word, but when I say that, I mean racism was the predominant thing in our society. Now it's not. It's just not. It's anti-racism that is dominant in our society, or ambivalent acceptance of anti-racism, which means you're not racist, right? And basically what happens is that racism, or the creation of the middle classes after industrialization, sort of gives the illusion of justification for what Du Bois calls the American assumption, that you can work really hard and get ahead. This was justified for the white people allowed into the middle classes, right? And then after the civil rights movement, people of color are allowed into the middle classes, and this begins to sort of this happens at the same time that imperialism is reaching a tipping point, and that happens. Globalization happens, etc. Technology takes off like never before in history, and we get reproletarianization, and all of this no longer has that American assumption that you can work really hard in the system and get ahead, that way making you a mobile sort of individual rather than a working person along with the rest of your class. It tears that to shreds. That can no longer happen. And people these days, as it's growing more and more apparent, as reproletarianization gets bigger and bigger like a snowball rolling down a hill, that's completely gone. So people, of course, are waking up and going, oh, yeah, we are a working class. Oh, yeah, racism was stupid. And let's do this. Let's create a new society that works for us rather than those assholes who sit on their asses getting rich off my work.
Right. And I think that phenomenon of reproletarianization is so important, and in the form that it takes in terms of social consciousness is an abandonment of the American assumption, right? And I see this, I mean, you see this all the time through social media. There's very popular accounts on Instagram that post memes and funny videos and stuff, and you'll see them every once in a while post something about politics or one of these mega rich billionaires. And, you know, the comment from the page, but also from like the first few comments with the most likes are very cynical. Like, yeah, sure, I'm just going to pull myself up by my bootstrap. Very easy to say when you know, your father was the owner of mines in South Africa. Or, you know, it's that. And, you know, there's that awareness that it doesn't matter how hard I work. I'm not going to get rich. I'm not going to live the life that the wealthy and, you know, the ruling elite tells me that I can live if I work hard enough, and that they're the ones that are actually not doing anything. They're just functioning as a class of parasites. And I think that today more than ever, that American assumption is gone.
It's funny how the people getting rich off us working harder are the ones telling us to work harder. Weird how that works, right?
Right. There's also a really good comment here from Marxist Saw that I wanted to bring up, which is that imagine if the Black Panther Party had popular support, the popular support that the Black Lives Matter movement had. Ending segregation was a qualitative leap to the working class realizing itself divorced from the corporate state. This is so incredibly important. And that's that, you know, the Black Lives Matter protest, even though, you know, obviously we supported it, even though it kind of, you know, Black Lives Matter Inc. Was subsumed somewhat under the Democratic Party.
The professional managerial leadership and all the corruption, and
the demands were, you know, also very vague. They centered a phenomenon of police violence, which, if we're completely honest, it isn't just about racism. Obviously, racism is there, but it's a problem of the armed bodies of the state terrorizing poor people, and you see that in the fact that a hell of a lot of white people are killed. The people that are killed the most in the U.S. are poor white people, and then, you know, poor people of color, which are killed by proportion at a higher rate. But still, that part is never talked about, because talking about that would lead people to realize that it's an attack of the armed bodies of men on the state, which represent monopoly capital, on poor people of all colors, and therefore the poor working class people of all colors could come together and fight together. And, you know, in a way, Black Lives Matter reduced it to just being racism. And I don't think the Black Panther Party would have ever done that, because they
definitely not.
With you know, certain flaws that they might have had, they were very much conscious of the necessity of a cross-racial working class struggle in order to achieve genuine emancipation. They were cognizant of the fact, you know, to reverse a quote that Marx introduces in the chapter on the working day in the first volume of Capital, which is that labor in the white skin cannot be freed if in the black it is branded. They understood that the opposite is also true. Labor in the black skin cannot be freed insofar as it continues to be branded in the white. And really what that means is that liberation is a collective effort that requires the emancipation of the whole working class. You can't emancipate one section of it and not the other, because it's going to perpetuate conditions as the ones that we saw after Reconstruction, and the ones that we've seen throughout our country's history, which is that racism, far from doing what the poor whites have thought it was going to do, which is elevate them, has really just chained both parts of the working class. There's that wonderful poster from the Communist Party, I believe in the 1930s or 1940s, which is racism chains both. And it's a black arm and a white arm, and they're both chained. And that's the reality of racism. It's something that brings down not only the individual that's functioning as the object of racist hate, but also the individual that's functioning as the subject of that racist attack. Both are brought down, especially since a lot of the more egregious crimes of racism in the past have been waged by, unfortunately, poor white, especially in the South.
Or Du Bois says it perfectly himself, right? He says there can be no perfect democracy curtailed by color, race, or poverty, but with all we accomplish all. Accomplishment of one is the accomplishment of the other, and you can't have a democracy without all of them. You can't have it when one race is left out. You can't have it when the impoverished aren't able to express themselves.
Absolutely. But it's a really good point here that Marxist Saw is making. If these Martin Luther King was at one point designated by the FBI the most dangerous man in America. He was, a big portion of the population hated him, and that big portion, was primarily this middle class, which I guess can be described in Marxist-Leninist terms as a form of a labor aristocracy, and the Black Panther Party wasn't very much popular. And, if these phenomenons would have taken root today, after the conditions that were created thanks to what they did in the 60s and 70s, they would have done so much more, I think, than what the Black Lives Matter movement was able to achieve, which, frankly, what was it able to achieve besides, mobilizing people who realize, okay, they're discontent and willing to hit the streets, but, there's no clear aims, there's no organization that can keep that movement going. So, but it's a really good point, right? If the BLM movement was able to do that much, which is, bringing out nearly 30 million Americans into the street, what can a movement that is more ideologically coherent, that centers class, and that really draws those connections on which solidarity can be laid between the attacks of the armed bodies of men, the police, on all poor people, in a way that the Black Lives Matter movement wasn't able to do it. I think there's tremendous potential.
Oh, 100%. And we're seeing the embryonic, the real lesson to draw from all of this that we just talked about is that even us talking about this means something. We're seeing the very first steps of this and overcoming the degradation of the whole last period of American history, where the left went away in the USA and was replaced by this middle class, just completely bourgeoisified charity movement, which is really what it is, which is so socially chauvinist. I don't even want to get into it, but we're beginning the process of overcoming that and supplanting it and taking the next revolutionary steps in our country's history. And that's a really big deal. And we can't minimize what that can do, what the horizon can be, because it is socialism. Half of the issue is always pretending that it's impossible, pretending no matter in what way that the way it is the way it always will be. And we can just try as hard as we can to tweak it a tiny bit here and there. But that's not the case. That's not how it actually happens. What happens is you come up against the impossibility of it continuing on the old way, and a whole new thing is created. That's what happened in the Civil War. That's what happened in Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement. It created an entirely new form of social relations on a higher stage, right, of development. Look at us nowadays, right? Go on this, even among Trump voters, and I'm really sick, by the way, of hearing this myth that Trump gave white people permission to be racist. Ask any single Trump voter, why'd you vote for Trump? You won't hear a single reply, he gave me permission to be racist. That's nonsense, right? They will say, and I know because I do this and I ask people this, they will say, guy said he wanted to bring jobs back. Guy was attacking the Clinton machine. Those are progressive things, right?
Right. I remember there was in the Labor for Bernie group, there was a guy that we had brought to talk. I believe it might have been from Ohio, actually. It was one of these, Rust Belt cities that lost all its industry. And he said that he was torn between Bernie and Trump in 2016. He ended up voting for Trump because of the promises to bring industry back. And Trump clearly did not do that. Now he was back with Bernie, and he was leading, I think regionally, the Labor for Bernie group. But I'm looking here for a comment that was quite good from Synthotic. Interesting name. Police commit class violence against the working class constantly. It's been this way since the beginning. That's absolutely correct.
Here, look, I got another one that's pretty good. Chaya Bot Speed says Trump voters are people with a siege mentality who are afraid of losing their traditional middle class way of life. I think that's yes and no. They're absolutely afraid of losing that middle class way of life, but it's already gone. For almost everyone, it's already gone. And Trump instead gives the finger to the establishment that they see as having taken it, which is actually a correct intuition on their part. The only problem is that Trump isn't the answer, right? And we know that. But that's why we appeal to these people and say, you're right. You got screwed. I got screwed. Trump, who, you praise because he says lock her up about Hillary, was at Hillary's wedding, right? He's not really going to bring your jobs back. And he didn't. He governed almost exactly like Obama governed, except he was maybe a little bit more oriented towards peace, with the thing in Korea. But other than that, he was basically Obama with mean rhetoric, right? And whatever, But so yeah, that's a great comment. I would just say yes and no.
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of the topics we bring up tomorrow because we want to talk about that Christian Parenti article in the Gray Zone about Trump's incoherent form of anti-imperialism and how those incoherencies, represented for empire a form of a threat. And that doesn't mean that he was an anti-imperialist or that he is an anti-imperialist or that he is genuinely for peace. I mean, we don't know. But if the past tells us anything, is that that's not the case. There's some areas where he was better than the Democrats, and there's other areas where he was more hawkish. Obama created the process of the Cuban thaw that began, the partial lifting of the blockade that took Cuba off of the state sponsor of terrorism list. And, it allowed the Cuban economy for a few years at least to revive itself, to have one of the highest GDPs in the region. And then Trump added all the sanctions again and, added everything again. And, then it was continued by Biden and then for a while expanded. And then it was cooled down again as of recent. But very inconsistent figure. So someone said here that Chris H said that 30 million Americans for BLM protests is pretty much the entire Canadian population. I think it's the biggest protest that they have registered in U.S. history. I think that the one for the first ever Earth Day was also fairly big. I think 20 to 25 million. But yeah, it
Fun
was nothing.
fact,
It was nothing.
Earth Day is on Lenin's birthday. They did that on purpose.
Eco Lenin.
Hmm. Well,
That's
they did that so they could take lefties away from. It's in the creation of the sort of controlled opposition left, right? They did that to take lefties away from the communists.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Not on.
That's
not
why
on,
they made Labor Day too, so less people would go out on May Day.
Right. Not only did the BLM movement in 2020 have up to 300K at one time in major cities, but it had demonstrations of dozens at little. Yeah. We were going out in Dubuque to those demonstrations, and it was all sorts of people. Such a politically diverse group. People like to think that it was just a bunch of liberals out there, but from
Right.
experience in the Midwest, that wasn't really the case. It was really just people pissed off at how fucked up the apparatuses of the state are.
Yeah.
And there's a genuine discontent that could have been mobilized towards something quite revolutionary.
If you want to see any kind of like solid proof that we are in a new period of anti-racism, look at how right across the color line that protest was, right? It was the black proletariat leading everybody, right? Before, the Democrats took it over and blah, blah, blah. But actually, a guy who's written a few pieces for us came to the Du Bois Symposium, it couldn't be a nicer guy, really great guy. But he said something really good there. And he said that in these white areas, like rural America, trailer parks, even the cul-de-sac, people were marching that had never marched before in their lives because a black man was killed because he was black. And that should symbolize something for us. That should be a symbol of how far we've come in this country. Millions upon millions of them, right? Not just a few. Millions upon millions. That's a big deal,
Right, especially if you consider that the U.S. population is 330 million.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how many of those are adults. I can't imagine it being more than 300 million. And there was a study that I read maybe 5 to 6 years ago now, which said that these mass mobilizations, pseudo-revolutionary movements, if they're able to include up to 3% of the population, there's a 90% chance that they succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the percentage of the population that was involved, especially of the adult population, it was anywhere from like 10 to 15% of Americans were involved in these protests.
Yeah.
And that's what the crisis is not in people's ability to go out and show willingness to go out into the streets. It's a crisis of leadership, I think. It's a crisis of ideas and organization, because if you pulled those numbers just statistically, right, you should be able to at least achieve something.
Mm-hmm.
But
and
again,
nothing happened.
Yeah.
Nothing. They named a street George Floyd Avenue, which is a slap in the face,
Well, the Democrats did that thing where they wore like the tribal print and they kneeled down. That was what it was all about, right? That's what everyone's.
Right. It's the same as like more female CEOs. Like, good for that CEO, but what's that do for the women's struggle? Goddamn nothing, And this is why all of these struggles are concrete forms of the universal process of class struggle that arise due to the historical motion, because they're not really about, diversifying the ruling class. They're about a giant community of millions of people needing liberation. And it's this ruling class that we align against, right? That is exploiting us, that is preventing that. And so it puts us all in a place where the proletariat carries with it the future of all of us and can rally the rest of the working classes to its side.
Right. And I think if you really look at the horizon today, there's so much to be hopeful about. You have a youth that sees very clearly, the vast majority of them, that it's a futureless future that they're going into. It's going to be extremely hard just to have the bare necessities that regular Americans, 50, 60 years ago were able to have, let alone, in the last generation, right? It's the first time in American history where a generation is going to be financially worse off than their parents. And this is something very serious, and in some circles is leading to youthful doomerism, and to different forms of reactions that are not the most helpful. But remember that, again, youthful, so there's going to be a process of maturation in a lot of these people. And I think that makes me real hopeful, because every poll that comes out shows that the youth is, would like 60 to 70% vote for a socialist candidate, and like 40% of them or something would vote for a communist candidate. And again, these are going to be the generations of the future, which are not only going to be more improved in the future, but are going to be the main voting block of the future, indoctrinating their kids with the ideas that they have, which I'm sure should have already going to start doing with my baby. I'm trying to get him to have his first word be Mao, so I can't imagine age not doing something similar.
Let me have one more stat in there. 25% of the American population would support an armed uprising against the state right now.
I had no idea.
That's crazy. That's never before happened in the history of this country. And what we're lacking is precisely what you just said, Carlos: leadership. We don't have a revolutionary organization, institution that can take all of these various struggles and movements and connect them tactically and strategically into one thing. And that's what we need. We need leaders to come out and say, look, no one else seems to be doing it, so I'll do it, right? Let's just get it done. We all need this, guys,
That should be the role of the Vanguard Party. Because
precisely.
To do that leadership role is very risky. Capital has a tendency of pushing working people materially in a position of resignation, political resignation, because if you try to organize your workplace, you can get fired, and that goes on your record. Your next employer can find out about it, and pretty soon, if you end up building up the reputation of a rebel rouser, of someone that tries to organize their coworkers, it's going to be very hard to get a decent job that helps you make a living. I mean, nowhere in the United States is minimum wage enough for people to survive. Even if it's raised to $15 an hour, which is what the progressives have been asking for some years, it still wouldn't be enough for a working class family to survive. So just put that into context. You have a situation where leadership is very hard, because the most militant sections of the working class, they have so much to lose if they take even the first step of going around and seeing who would be interested in unionizing. And you see that in the Starbucks stores, that one of the ways that they have fought against unionizing now has been by closing the stores that have voted in favor of unionization. And obviously that has an effect on the workers in other stores who clearly do not want to lose their job at a time when inflation is running rampant, and things are just getting worse and worse and worse. So what would be the role of the Vanguard Party? It would be to take those most militant segments of the working class, those people that have the charisma to have others lead them and to trust them into engaging in class struggle, even though there are these great burdens that can come about when capital turns its hand and against labor trying to fight for a better future. The role of the Vanguard Party would be to sustain these people as professional revolutionaries.
Precisely. The
There is
party.
the
Let's
resources.
explain what that is real quick, though, Carlos.
Yeah.
A professional revolutionary is exactly what it says on the box, right? It's you are paid by the party to be a revolutionary. You get a salary, and the organization that we believe has the potential to do this is a communist party, right? And in our era of all this just limitless potential, this needs to start happening, but it needs to be done in a way that is theoretically sound. You can't have a professional revolutionary that doesn't understand what Marxism is, that comes from the PMC. You need working class people who educate themselves in real Marxism. So, education, then professionalization. That is the order of events. And if you're in the party, this is what you need to be pushing for. Or if you're in any party, this is what you need to be pushing for.
That's absolutely the only way that things are going to be able to get done today. Because the incentives of just, of resignation, because of the place that you'll end up in if you try to do what you have to do to further the interests of the class struggle. It's very difficult, and the only way to curtail that would be with a communist party that can fund professional revolutionaries and give these people a sense of material security in the activities that they are doing. There's a question here. We have to go in maybe 10 to 15 minutes, but there's a question here that I didn't want to leave unanswered. It's from Aroa, who has a beautiful giraffe as a profile picture. What is the communist position on voting? It seems like there's a huge split, a huge guilt trip about those who don't vote or vote Republican. Should we still vote?
It's a good question. I think it was Engels who said that at the very least, participation in a bourgeois election can allow us to get our message out there and count our forces, see how much support we have. But that doesn't mean support some bourgeois party, right? At certain times, maybe not. If we have the power to force a bourgeois organization to do what has to be done for us, for the working class, then I'd consider it. Right now, no. I don't think these bourgeois parties deserve anything but ridicule and destruction. There's like some argument that Lenin would have voted Democrat, which is absolutely absurd. We don't dogmatically say we vote or don't vote, right? That's sort of anarchistic, just like because of your noble ideals, you're too good to participate in a bourgeois election. That's not it at all. Lenin recommends always doing what is best for the interests of the revolution and the proletariat overall, right? So that changes tactically based on the conditions you're in. And sometimes it'll be running our own candidates. Sometimes it'll be running our own candidates to win. Sometimes it'll be running our own candidates in order to split a vote. Sometimes it'll be just getting our message out there. Other times it'll be trying to pit one bourgeois group against another. There's a million different things to consider. So end of the day, there's no real thing, but never, ever let anyone guilt trip you about voting. If they try to guilt trip you about not voting for the Democrats, they're not a Marxist.
I thought you were going to say at the end there, if if they're going to guilt trip you about not voting for Democrats, you come and tell me, and I'll go kick their ass.
That too.
Yeah. But no, that's a great response. Lenin talks a lot about this in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, which is the book that a lot of these people use to justify, right opportunism. And he's also very clear about like what the purpose would be of having communists in positions of power within bourgeois parliaments or bourgeois congresses, which is, it's a difficult situation because sooner or later they're going to be forced by the necessity of realpolitik to betray the interests of the working class. And I had we talked to Tom the other day about Eurocommunism, his recent book, Eurocommunism. Um, a critical reading of Santiago Gordillo and Eurocommunist revisionism. And one of the things he mentioned was that a leader of the Communist Party in Brazil, who he's friends with, good friends with, they were appointed in Brazil, one of the positions in the Ministry of Sports by Lula. And then they wanted to build a stadium, and the stadium required tearing down, the housing of a lot of working class people. So who had to do that, that difficult action of carrying through the tearing down of working class homes in order to build a stadium that perhaps those working class people can only afford to go in once or twice a year. Well, it was the communists because of their position in the Ministry of Sports. So that sort of paradox was something that Lenin was trying to avoid in his engagement with parliamentary politics, because he doesn't want the communists, in order to to sustain the position that they have in parliamentary politics, to have to betray the interests of the working class. And it seems like inevitably that ends up being, the case sooner or later. So it's a real quandary that 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 presents itself, because you do want to engage in parliamentary politics with a working class party or with a communist party. Again, not with a bourgeois imperialist party that can kind of be called fascistic by every definition of what fascism means, can be called fascistic just as much as the other party. It was the working class communist party who could participate in elections because, even though bourgeois democracy is obsolete in terms of world history, it might not be obsolete in terms of the working class of a particular nation. And we know that in the U.S., politics, electoral politics is a sort of team sports that people participate in big chunks of the country, 50 to 60%. It's still something that's very much paid attention to, and the way that people think about politics. So I do think that you do have to engage in politics and in running candidates, and and mobilizing people to vote for socialist working class candidates. I don't think that there's any position in Lenin or in pretty much anyone in the Marxist tradition which would say that you should be voting for one bourgeois imperialist party over another because of minor differences, which I don't think are minor anymore. That argument for the lesser of two evils is going to be very hard to make in 2024 when we have a party that's taking us towards a third world war that's going to be nuclear in character.
Yeah.
Another party that's going to possibly postulate a guy that's is presenting himself as a peace candidate and talking in a way very similar to how communists talk about how Ukraine has been set up by the U.S., and that this has been basically a proxy war against Russia and the involvement of Victoria Nuland. So it's going to be very, very hard to make the argument for the lesser of two evils when the one that was usually seen as the quote unquote greater evil is now postulating itself as a candidate of
As the
peace
lesser evil.
in the face of nuclear war. So objectively, the lesser evil.
What this does is it proves, I think it was Lenin. My memory's fuzzy sometimes, but I think it was Lenin who said the best use of a bourgeois parliament for us is to show how the bourgeois parliament gets nothing done for us, for the working class, right? Excuse me. And that is a perfect time for it. If Trump runs as a peace candidate, which he's almost certainly going to do, what then happens to all of those people who say, well, Democrats are the lesser evil? I know you hate Biden, but just hold your nose and vote for him, right? Are they going to say that about Trump? Hell no, they're not. Hell no, they're not. And it will show them as hollow and just another chip in that shell of illegitimacy. And we need to exploit that. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we need to build up our institutions, right? We need to make sure people see our faces, see communists as leaders.
Absolutely. The fate of the country is in the hands of socialists, and I would even say the fate of the world, just because of the power that the U.S. empire has globally. And the conditions today are materially more favorable than ever for the development of subjective conditions. You already have, 20%, only 20% of the American population sees that Congress is playing a positive role and actually representing. That means that 80% of the people don't feel represented by their representatives. And this is very easy to explain by rooting it in how the existing state and therefore the governments that arise and go in the existing state are all really a dictatorship of capital. They're there to represent the interests of the people that fund them, of the class that's the dominant economic force in society, which is, this massive monopoly capitalist, finance capitalist class. And the military industrial complex, the medical pharmaceutical complex, these various monopolies that all collaborate with one another and collaborate with politicians and and screw the working class consistently. And working people are coming to see that in this country. And it couldn't be a better moment to form some form of third party movement that's grounded perhaps less in the idea that there could actually be a genuine victory in the ballot box, but more so on the idea that what's really important is being able to organize working people at a grassroots level, at their workplaces, in their communities, and start creating these networks of solidarity across working class communities, across progressive social movements, across Marxist institutes and progressive institutes. That's what really counts. And if that can reflect itself into a victory in the electoral arena, then fine. But we've seen, from history that it isn't usually the case that the socialists who win by the ballot are able to do very much or keep power for very long. So I think the importance is in organizing the people and getting to the people and learning from the people, and in part thanks to the ability to learn from the people and learning how to guide the people towards where it is that we have to go.
So there's one thing I really want to focus on here, and how we judge all of the bourgeois electoral system. Be very, very conscious of how easy it is to flip to a purity fetish sort of way of looking at it. And you say, this person said something unenlightened from my subjective point of view, right? Instead, think materially about what can further develop the revolutionary aspect of society, us. What can get us in a better position to take power? And make no mistake, this is precisely what we mean to do. We mean to overthrow an entire class, the most powerful class in history, right? We want to overthrow them and put our class, the working class, in power, right? Think about that. And then think about, what do you think this is? You think we're all going to tiptoe through the tulips? No, there's going to be a lot of vulgarity and a lot of cutthroat actions going on. Put the purity fetish away. Think about what's good for the people. You do that, and you can't go wrong.
Right. Absolutely agree with you. I wanted to let everyone know before we go that we have officially put every single Midwestern Marx Publishing Press published text, whether it's our 4 books or our 2 journal issues. We've officially put them up as ebooks, starting at around $4 to I think $8. It might be less, but so yeah, check those out. I have linked it in the chat. It's midwesternmarx.com/books. So again, you can help our institute by becoming a Patreon financially, or I think now we have the capacity for people to become members on YouTube. I'm not very up to date on the technology there, but I think that helps. I saw already talking about it in one of the past streams that he did. But you can also help us by help us fund the institute through buying our books, whether our physical copies or now our ebook copies, which again you can find at midwesternmarx.com/books. We have much more events similar to the one that Noah just went on.
Let me interrupt real quick. If anyone wants like signed copies of stuff or anything like that, get a hold of us and let us know, and we'll try to work something out for you.
Absolutely. We have many more events like the one that Noah just went on, which requires gas money, money for hotels, and money for food. So if you can help fund our institute so that our pool of resources are greater in order to have more events such as these, that would be great. We have upcoming in 2 months. One of our comrades, Kayla Papachet, is going to be going to Cuba on a brigade, officially representing the Midwestern Marx Institute. So that's really exciting, and we're going to have to raise $1,500 for that. So we hope to put out a fundraiser starting now. I know we started the NOAA one quite late, so we have to get ahead of things and start that now so that we can fundraise, for that.
On that one, let me pull a page from my father-in-law's book, who was a union organizer for the pipe fitters. It was a pipe fitter his whole life. Whenever they had a mutual aid organization, and they did real mutual aid, by the way, not just charity and called it mutual aid. Say somebody got hurt or whatever, if there was some guy who didn't want to kick in, he'd say, "Open up your wallet, you cheapskate." Open it up, cheapskate. Yeah.
We have a whole lot of working people that don't have much. So don't give.
I'm joking.
If you don't have the means. If you do and you're willing to, that always helps. But you can always help by sharing the streams, by liking, by sharing the videos, by sharing our posts on Twitter or Instagram or wherever it might be, by letting your friends and your family members know about Midwestern Marx. That helps not only the Institute, but the struggle for socialism, as we're embarking in a project of educating the American masses about their current conditions and the roots of the evils that they experience on their day-to-day life. So anything you would like to plug before we go, Noah?
Not really. I just want to thank all of you again for helping us out, and a big shout out and thank you to Emily, Doc, and everybody at the free school.
Absolutely. All right, folks. Thank you all for being here. We're going to end today's stream with the introductory video, which we started. So thanks again and have a good night.
And economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.